All right, so I want to thank you all for your patience, and we will now begin our community forum on budget reductions. We'll begin here, and then we'll go to breakout rooms after we do our opening comments. So on behalf of my colleagues on the Columbus Board of Education, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts and concerns and hopefully some constructive ideas as well. Let me start by saying that every investment we make as a district is valuable, and behind the dollar signs are the faces of our more than 51,000 students and nearly 9,000 staff. These conversations about potential budget reductions are not meant to discredit the value of any person or any program. If we had our way, we would keep every item listed, but instead we understand that priorities must be set when the state fails to provide full funding. I hope you appreciate that our process has been data-driven and respectful, and that our board and our district leaders are here tonight with open minds and a willingness to have constructive conversations. Staff from the district will be capturing your feedback throughout the night. And the start of tonight's meeting is also being streamed on Facebook Live, so more of our community members can follow along. If you're not able to share your thoughts tonight, or you have an idea or concern that comes to you later, please make sure you still share that feedback, either online, on our app, by phone, through email or regular mail, and in person where possible. So to begin, I'll ask our district treasurer and chief financial officer, Stan Bohoric, to run through the numbers of the financial forecast so we all better understand how we got where we are today. Then we'll hear from our interim superintendent, Dr. John Stanford. He'll launch us into those conversations. And again, let me just, on behalf of the entire Board of Education, thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you, President Baker. My role this evening is to recap a presentation that I did to the board on January 30th and bring you and the audience. You're going to move. Okay, I'll wait. Okay. My role is to bring you up to date from 2016 when we were in the throes of levy planning and discuss a bit about some of the very important assumptions that we made along the way and how they have changed. Back in 2016, probably the most critical assumption that we made related to our forecast was relative to the growth in the cap on state funding. At that point in time, we assumed that what we had been receiving in the biennium would continue, and that is that the cap would grow at the rate of 7.5% annually. Suddenly getting very lonely up here. It's like, oh my. But that was the most critical assumption. We did an October forecast, which had fiscal 21 in a deficit position, but we knew that a month later we had a levy on the ballot that would help solve that issue. In December, we updated the forecast as a result of the passage of the levy, and that did bring the deficit for 21 back up to a more manageable, about 17 million of a deficit. Just a month later, in January, the state budget discussion began for their next biennium, the biennium that we are currently in, and rumblings from the State House were that the cap would not grow as it had in the past, and we heard ranges of growth rates from 0% to, say, 5.5%. In May of 17, we updated the forecast once again with our best estimates and best information that we had at that time, and that forecast included the cap to grow at about plus 5%. After the board adopted that resolution in May, the biennial budget was approved in June, and as we reviewed those results in July, we found that the cap was going to grow at plus 4%. So the major contributing factor to the deficit that we see at this point is that change in assumption that the state revenue, yes ma'am. No ma'am, not yet. Thank you. We're good. So the biggest change over the time period was that the assumption about the growth in the cap did not come true. In October of 17, our most recent forecast, we prepared that, and in October of 17 versus what we did in calendar year 16, you see that fiscal year 17 rolls back into actual, so it's off the projected portion, and fiscal 22 rolls into our financial horizon. So in October of 17, what we adopted, there were really no changes in much of the revenue forecast or expenditure forecast, but it was all having to do with the state revenue change. So faced with this deficit and needing to begin to prepare a plan to at least begin to address that deficit, and also operating under some goals or directives that we had heard from the board, and those three were to, first of all, not count on any levy campaign until 2020. And when you do a forecast, you can't include any future levies anyway. To keep our levy promise, to add FTE that were in that levy plan, and also to the best we could minimize the impact on programming. So with that in mind, we had to turn to looking at expenditure reductions and evaluating all of our line items for possible reduction. To put our thoughts in order, I presented to the administrative team a matrix. There's no magic to this, but it was just a way for us to think about reductions and perhaps categorize them and help us prioritize them. And first would be to consider whether the program or the expenditure is required or not required. And the definition of required could be state law, the definition could be board policy. It can vary, but it's one way to begin to categorize. And then secondly, we wanted to look at the return on our investment. If we're spending certain dollars, what's the return that the district and the students and the community receive from that investment? That return could be high, it could be low. That return could be quantitative or it could be qualitative. So as we looked at our line items, we tried to evaluate them in this sense and begin to help us prioritize them. I did remind everyone, and this I remind the board all the time, that as we plan and we talk about these deficits, it seems to reference a 0 point or a zero balance. And in fact, best practice is not that we plan to zero, it's that we plan to 30 days cash. And for this district, it's approximately $80 million. So as you begin to put this in perspective and context relative to that 30-day cash balance, you'll see that it's even worse than what it looks, because 224, actually, if we were going to plan for our projected cash balance of 80 million, you're about 304 million short. As we began our discussions, we did get some good news. The federal government, not that the federal government almost shut down, but to prevent a federal government shutdown, a continuing resolution was adopted, and in that continuing resolution was an extension of the implementation of what's known as the Cadillac tax, part of the Affordable Care Act. That does impact the school district, so we factor that into the cash balance projection, and we pick up about 12 million out to fiscal 22. So we did put that in the plan. You heard me earlier discuss that our conservative forecasting generally generates a positive cash flow each year. And while we do not include that assumption in our forecast, in the planning and in the preparation for looking at expenditures, we wanted to add that in and assume that that will happen, and therefore we won't have to address, that will reduce the amount of the deficit that we have to address through expenditure reduction. We looked at that at about 15 million a year, or 60 million out to 21, 22. So now the projected deficit would look like 152 million, and that helped. After quite a bit of discussion, many meetings, we then have a list of about 21 million in proposed reductions, which will be presented and discussed tonight. Again, I reminded the board and reminded staff that with a target of 80 million, that, well, there's the 21 million reductions up to 68 million deficit, that even then, we're still about 148 million short to hit our $80 million target. So it was in that context that we approached identifying potential reductions, prioritized them, and then have presented them several times in various venues for the purpose of discussion, and this is our second of 4 meetings that we'll be taking input. Just to remind of the assumptions, first of all, we tried to stay true to the board's priorities. We assumed no change in revenue assumptions from our October forecast. We assumed that the Cadillac tax would remain, the delay would remain in effect. We have learned that sometimes the federal government can give you something and then take it away, but in this case, we're assuming that it will stay delayed. We've also assumed that the conservative forecast will yield, in fact, a $15 million per year positive cash flow, and that the reductions that we propose to begin in fiscal year 19-20, next school, I'm sorry, 18-19, next school year, those reductions would remain in force through fiscal 22. And in that way, the $21 million that we would reduce out of next year's budget, because it carries forward for 4 years, generates about $84 million worth of savings by 2022. And lastly, we always need to keep in mind our 30-day cash balance. Those are the major assumptions that we made, how they've changed and impacted our forecast from 2016 up to where we stand today at this point in time. So with that, I believe I'll turn it back to Dr. Stanford for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Treasurer Behort. Tonight, we are inviting you, the community, to talk with members of the district's leadership team who have identified the potential budget reductions which would take effect as a part of the 2018-2019 school year. Reductions of this magnitude are never a one-cut-fits-all solution. Reductions of this type are the type that have a significant impact, and so that's why we are seeking your input in this process. Overall, our team grouped these proposed reductions around 3 action items. First, we looked for opportunities where we could reduce costs but not eliminate certain supports. Second, we identified a number of district-level responsibilities and staffing positions which could be reallocated back to the school building level. And last but not least, there are several proposed reductions that realign many of our operational services to minimal levels and realign certain academic offerings to reflect state-mandated requirements. To be clear, in a budget predominantly driven by personnel expenses, which is about 85% of our general revenue fund, reductions of this magnitude will certainly impact personnel numbers district-wide. So you will see more than 160 proposed FTE reductions this evening. This is a combination of certificated, classified, and administrative positions. And our hope is that the significant number would be handled through attrition. Again, we want to hear from you. We want to be able to answer your questions and to provide some clarity on the proposed reductions. And we want to enlist your help and to get your insight this evening. Throughout the night, our team will ask if there are alternative ways in which we could still accomplish our outcomes, but perhaps we do it in a more efficient and cost-effective way. And we will ask you if you can think of any additional everyday savings that could be implemented either in the classroom, at the building level, or district-wide. Now we are at the point where we want to break you out into 3 rooms for small group discussions with our leadership team members. In the first breakout room, leading that session will be our Chief Academic Officer, Alicia Gillison. Mrs. Gillison will be leading the discussion on proposed reductions in academic services. That group will meet in the cafeteria. Next, we will try to answer your questions about district operations and our accountability office measures, including questions about transportation, school choice, and building services. That conversation will be led by our Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Maurice Oldham. Mr. Oldham, please stand up and wave. Mr. Oldham, please stand up and wave. And our Chief Accountability Officer, Dr. Michelle Klein. Dr. Klein? Okay. Well, you've seen Mr. Oldham. That conversation will occur in room 126. Again, room 126. Finally, all other proposed reductions will be addressed by our budget director, Mr. Scott Gooding. Mr. Gooding, are you still in the room? Okay. Okay. Mr. Gooding and the team in that room will try to answer your questions that relate to board services, the budget office, communications, WCBE, legal services, and the offices of the treasurer, the superintendent, internal auditor, and all other district-wide services. The conversation for that group will be in room 127. You do not need to stay in one room the entire evening. You are more than welcome to, once your questions have been answered in one room or you've heard enough in one room, you can transition to another room to be a part of that conversation in that particular room. It really is up to you. It's your choice how long you want to stay in each room. We will not be coming back to this room at the end of the evening. We will dismiss everyone from the breakout rooms. And so we would like to start the discussions in the breakout rooms around 6:45. So we've got about 5 minutes to transition into the breakout rooms. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to the conversation.